Okay, so now is the time that I'm actually going to do the power supply. And this one's a little bit different, but it's really the last piece of hardware we need to be like super functional. And these are going to install easier than some we have in the past. So what you're going to do is try to flip your PC over until you get on the back side. Now we're not going to be using these drives, so this is totally optional. You guys can use these mounts if you want to, or you can take these off and try to store them. These are for solid state drives that are a little bit bigger, and then some hard drives you can put them in the same spot as well. But basically this is to hide the drives so you're not seeing them on the other side. But we're not actually going to make use of them. I also have all of this stuff that we have to make sense of later. These are our front panel connectors, our USB, front panel audio, and a couple other specialty things that we'll deal with. But our power supply is pretty much going to take up this space right here. It's important to note, if you have a really big power supply, these drives have screws that can come out. So you can actually have a power supply take up this entire length of the case if you had a power supply big enough. We shouldn't have that issue. But the power supply is going to be pretty easy. We're going to install it and then run the power cords around, and then we'll start getting into power cord routing and things like that before we go any further forward. So power supply, right, is actually smaller than most that have this kind of wattage because of how they're trying to design them these days. But there it is. When you open your power supply, this one's going to be a little bit different than the rest that I've done before because we won't have any wires connected to it. So it should be much easier to install than previous. Everything's totally modular. So all your wires are actually going to be in this case. We're going to plug and play from the wires here. But for installing the module, all we need to do is slide this guy into place. All right? And if you align it correctly, you'll see screw holes. If you don't, there's a pretty good chance you have it in upside down. So here's the thing about power supplies. They all should have a fan because the power supply gets really, really, really super hot. The fan should run to push all this hot air away. So when you're installing it, all these wires should go internal to your case, but the plug and the switch that we usually see should go outside. And the fan should always orient to its exhaust side. And if you look at the bottom of the case, there's actually this fancy little exhaust port with a removable screen. See that? Fancy. Not really. Install the power supply into the slot, and it should go in there pretty easily. And then you're going to try to kind of mock it up in place. The screws should align with all of these holes. And I know they're kind of hard to see, but you'll see them whenever you're putting your PC together. There should be 4 screws towards the edges of the case, but they basically manufactured the specs, so if you put it in upside down, you can't actually screw it in. And the screws we're going to be using can be close, right, to the case screws. Usually they are the same as the case screws, but when in doubt, you can always put your power supply in, and then just ever so gently, right, try to screw in a screw. If you don't get everything except for a little bit of resistance, it's probably a good chance you have the right screw. I didn't get any resistance there, so I'm going to try another one. This was my mid-range screw, right? It's about mid-range in the thread pattern. It's also kind of tapered. See if you can get a better view of it, right? And I'm just going to see if it screws into one of the screw holes. Pretty easy. That's it. Now with power supplies, you're actually going to cut some new threads on the back side, so it will get a little bit forceful, but the first few turns should go pretty well. And this is kind of like your motherboard, right? Don't tighten your screws until you've got them all there. If you tighten your screws down and you're off just even by the littlest bit, I'm out of screws. Never mind. Then the screws actually won't be aligned for you to even get it through. So leave them loose until you get all of them in. Come on. Should be one more screw. There's not. Hold. So see, that was because I was stupid. These are the screws that go into the power supply. They are the same thread pattern as the ones I was putting in, but I hadn't even taken them out of the bag yet. So that was my screw up. So you guys will probably want to use the ones from the bag. I was using the extras from the PC. These are the ones you'll actually want to go in. And I'm going to go ahead and do it now That way I can save these extras for anything else I might need with my case later on, like if you lose a screw. All right, that's really where everything comes in. So we'll get these all screwed in, and then our power supply should be mounted, and we can do really whatever else we need. The glorious thing about us having a modular power supply is that we're only going to have to put in the wires we need. Previously, everything was connected to the power supply. The real big pain in the butt. You had all these big, huge wires clogging up the case and nothing really to do with them. So the modular design can be a little bit more expensive, but it's also better for cable management. You guys are going to find out I am a very big stickler for cable management. So now that our power supply's in, we can start wiring stuff up to the different parts of the board. Okay, so this is probably going to be the hardest part physically for people to do. So now that we got our modular stuff in, I realized it's not going to be easy to plug that stuff in, because I have fat hands and they don't want to go in here and plug stuff in very well. Now the good thing is we only really need 2 main wires off to power things for right now. This cord is your main ATX 24-pin power connector. It's going to plug in here where it says MB, right? And it actually splits it off on one side so you can't plug it into anything else. So when you'll plug in, you'll basically plug these 2 here, and then the other end is going to run up through this slot, and it will go in to power our motherboard, right? And I'll show you guys that here in a second on the other side. The other one we're going to need to use is this cord that actually doesn't have a label. It has 8 pins on one side, and then it has 2 4-pins that are kind of split on the other side. So this is what's actually going to go to the motherboard to power our CPU, and then this end is going to come over and connect to the power supply. Now as far as other power cables, we don't need anything else. They do give us PCIe connectors, so if you do have a graphics card, right, there's a PCIe slot here, and then there's actually another one right there. So you can plug in 2 PCIe cords and power 2 different graphics cards if you wanted to, but that's totally optional, only if you have one to power. We also have this is actually another PCIe cord. We also have peripheral power, right? These are our peripheral connectors. The Molex is still there. It runs to a 6-pin connector if it needs to. And then the last one they have is SATA power. So you guys could connect this into the power supply if you had other stuff that needed to be powered. External hard drives, if you have some kind of RGB setup, we'll probably use this one for our RGB later because it's SATA power and it's actually going to plug in to one of our front panel connectors. But I'll detail that later. For right now, we should just need these 2 coming from our power supply. So I'll go ahead and get those plugged in. Okay, so I got those plugged into the the power supply, and it actually wasn't that bad. Now, your CPU power, I'm going to flip this over so I can show you guys where I'm routing all the wires. The CPU power is probably going to go through right here at the top corner because our CPU plug should be right around this area on the other side of the board. Our motherboard power will get brought in probably right about here just because of how it looks. So I'm going to go ahead and drop those through. Right, and you just want to be careful. You don't want to shove stuff through there. You kind of just want to ease it through the slot. And then you can see on the other side, I have 2 power connectors, if I can get the light right. I have 2 power connectors up top. I have an 8-pin, and then I have another 4-pin off to the side of it. We don't need to use both. It is an either or depending on the processor. The littler one was for less power, but we have a bigger processor, so we're going to have to use this 8-pin plug. There's not much of a difference, except for the fact that we would use either half, right, or all of this connector. And the tab is on the top, so basically when you fold it over, you can plug these in one at a time, and they will only plug in one way, one orientation. So you can plug in one side, and then the other. It's not the easiest thing in the world, and you want to make sure it's all snug down, but that's your CPU power. Okay, it's kind of nice and out of the way now. Your motherboard power is easy. You guys have seen this plenty of times. Your tab is on the outside edge of your motherboard, so you want to make sure your tab goes there. But you're really just folding it over and bending the wires to plug in the way you want them to. And you'll see some of them kind of have a natural orientation that they like. But once you get everything plugged in, should be good to go. And it's all nice and neat now that we've run all the power cords back behind, so you don't have to deal with much of anything there. We're going to have to reroute it once we get the rest of these set, but aside from that, it's going to be hidden for the most part. That's why we like a lot of these cases.